I'm Hale Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program. We really are very privileged to have with us David Finkel, who is the author of The Good Soldiers, an account of the Iraq War that the New York Times cited as one of the top 10 books of 2009, and reviewers have described as a masterpiece. And I just finished reading it, and I must say it really is a masterpiece. I've been at the center for almost 10 years, of which I think 8 years I've been working with Lee Hamilton, and I don't think I've ever heard him praise a book as much as he has seriously praised this book. Even today we had the board and council meeting of the Wilson Center, and he mentioned what a superb book this is. So it's a treat having you back at the center. Part of the book was written here.
Yes, it was.
And
a good part.
So a good part of it was written here.
All the verbs were.
So we really are delighted to have Mr. Finkel, who is an editor and writer for the Washington Post, and he's going to share with us some, his experience in Iraq, which he mentions in the book. He will read to us some passages of the book, and then he will take questions from the audience. David, wonderful having you with us.
Thank you. And it's not good to be back. It's actually great to be here, because when I interviewed to be a fellow, I remember someone saying, well, this would be for, you would be a policy scholar. And wanting to be as honest as I could, I said, in the book I have in mind, there's not going to be a whole lot of policy in it. And they said, don't worry, we really run the gamut here from policy to scholarship. So let's hope there's some scholarship in what I'm about to talk about. Or else I have to give the money back, I think. The other reason I wanted to come is the book came out in mid-September. I've talked about it quite a bit. There's a difference talking about it here because of the nature of the audience. This is a place that matters, that has an effect on policy. And part of what I hope comes through today is the necessity, when you formulate policy, in thinking about the full spectrum of the effects of that policy. Rather simplistic point, but perhaps what I illuminate here will make some sense. Friends tell me the worst way to start a talk is by reading an excerpt, and so I'd like to read an excerpt. And this is how the book begins, and I think it sets up what I want to talk about. The main character, by the way, is a lieutenant colonel named Ralph Koslerich. His soldiers weren't yet calling him the lost cause behind his back, not when this began. The soldiers of his who would be injured were still perfectly healthy, and the soldiers of his who would die were still perfectly alive. A soldier who was a favorite of his, and who is often described as a younger version of him, hadn't yet written of the war in a letter to a friend, "I've had enough of this bullshit." Another soldier, one of his best, hadn't yet written in the journal he kept hidden, "I've lost all hope. I feel the end is near for me, very, very near." Another hadn't yet gotten angry enough to shoot a thirsty dog that was lapping up a puddle of human blood. Another, who at the end of all this would become the battalion's most decorated soldier, hadn't yet started dreaming about the people he had killed and wondering if God was going to ask him about the two who had been climbing a ladder. Another hadn't yet started seeing himself shooting a man in the head, and then seeing the little girl who had just watched him shoot the man in the head every time he shut his eyes. For that matter, his own dreams hadn't started yet either, at least the ones that he would remember, the one in which his wife and children and friends were in a cemetery surrounding a hole into which he was suddenly falling. His dreams would be along soon enough, but in early April 2007, Ralph Koslerich, a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel who had led a battalion of some 800 soldiers into Baghdad as part of George W. Bush's surge, was still finding a reason every day to say it's all good. He would wake up in eastern Baghdad, inhale its bitter, burning air, and say it. It's all good. He would go past the blast walls, the sandbags, the bunkers, the aid station where the wounded from other battalions were treated, the annex where they assembled the dead, and say it. He would say it in his little office with his walls cracked from various explosions while reading the morning's emails from his wife. I love you so much. I wish we could lay naked in each other's arms, bodies meshing together, perhaps a little sweat. From his mother in rural Washington State after some surgery, I must say the sleep was the best I've had in months. Everything turned out to be normal, goody goody. From his father, I have laid awake many nights since I last saw you, and have often wished I could be alongside you to assist in some way. He would say it on his way to the chapel, where he would attend Catholic Mass conducted by a priest who had to be flown in by helicopter because the previous priest was blown up in a Humvee. He would say it when he went in his Humvee into the neighborhoods of eastern Baghdad, where more and more roadside bombs were exploding now that the surge was underway, killing soldiers, taking off arms, taking off legs, causing concussions, exploding eardrums, leaving some soldiers angry and others vomiting and others in sudden tears. Not his soldiers, though, other soldiers from other battalions. It's all good, he would say when he came back, and it could seem like a nervous tic, this thing that he said, or a prayer of some sort. Or maybe it was a declaration of optimism, simply that, nothing more, because he was optimistic, even though he was in the midst of a war that to the American public and the American media, and even to some in the American military, seemed all over in April 2007 except for the pessimism, the praying, and the nervous tics, but not to him. Well, here are the differences George W. Bush had said, announcing the surge, and Ralph Koslerich had thought, will be the difference. My battalion, my soldiers, me. And every day since then, he had said it. It's all good, after which he might say the other thing he often said, always without irony and utterly convinced, we're winning. He liked to say that too. Except now, on April 6, 2007, at 1 a.m., if someone banged on his door, waking him up, he said something different. What the fuck, he said, opening his eyes. That's how the book begins, and I wanted to start there because we've come a long way since then. Here we go into Afghanistan more fully. In Baghdad, in Iraq, U.S. troops are out of the cities. They're massing to begin coming home in full force next year. And to many people, the war might pretty much seem over. We can talk about whether that's true or not, but that's a feeling among many people. But in early 2007, when the surge began and when this book was written, that wasn't the case at all. In fact, the moment at hand to very many people felt like the lost moment, beyond which could only be tragedy. And into that moment, when the surge was announced, this Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Koslerich led his battalion into East Baghdad to be part of the surge. The battalion, 800 soldiers, average age 19. Most of these guys on their first deployment, although others had been on multiple deployments. And what the book does, what the book basically does is it's a simple book that tells at a ground level what happened, the far effects of policy, if you will. And it's a simple structure. Some guys went to war, things happened to them, they came home. And that's what the book does. It is not a first-person book. It's a piece of observed journalism, and it was done at a time when, if you think back to 2007, the great policy books about the war had been done and out and had their effect. Memoirs were starting to come out. But the piece of journalism that seems to occur once, twice, three times in any war hadn't yet been done in Iraq. So I decided to take a leave from the Washington Post and go write about these guys. 800 guys, fairly naive and optimistic when they went. When they came home, they were on the ground 14 months. And when they came home, of course they were changed by what had happened to them. The deal in going over there was this. I promised the lieutenant colonel that I was coming over with no agenda. It was not a polemic. I wasn't there to say the surge was good, the surge was bad, the war was won, the war was lost. It had nothing to do with that. It was simply, that might emerge from the story, but the idea was simply to go and see what happened to these guys, to not write about this war, but an attempt to use this war to write about the character of men pretty much in any war. The area they went to, by the luck of the draw, was in East Baghdad. Sunnis were to the west. It was a Shiite area to the east, outside of Sadr City. And they were there as part of a counterinsurgency strategy, which meant that every day they would go out into the neighborhoods of East Baghdad to try to give a sense that if you protect the population, everything else will fall into place. Also gain intelligence, and at night go round up what they called the bad guys to make things better and better. I want to show, before I talk about what happened to them, let me show a video of what a typical day was like there, if this works.
Sure.
If you've ever wondered what the surge felt like, this is what it felt like. Blue sky, hot temperatures, another mission to get from here to there, another convoy. Each convoy had 4 or 5 Humvees. Each Humvee had 4 or 5 soldiers inside. Each soldier was wearing 70 pounds of gear. They always wore body armor that encased them in thick ceramic plates. They wore bullet-resistant glasses, heat-resistant gloves, knee pads, and elbow pads. They carried tourniquets, bandages, 240 rounds of ammunition, and grenades. All of them carried an assault rifle. Some of them carried good luck charms. Some would sit with one foot in front of the other, so if a roadside bomb went off, they might lose one foot instead of 2. Sometimes they joked about what their last words would be. But always, every day, they would get in their Humvees and off they would go. This day, the trip was from one base in eastern Baghdad to another, along a road called Route Pluto. They drove at 10 miles per hour, maybe 15, to increase chances of finding a bomb before it went off. Finally, almost there, the first Humvee turned right off the main road. You can see it in the distance right now. There it goes. And then...
Get a radio call with him.
This day there were some injuries, but no deaths. Other days were different, but every day felt like this in the surge. This is what could happen at any moment. This is what it was like. This comes up. Hang on one sec. Basically, in East Baghdad, the weapon of choice was a particular type of roadside bomb called an EFP. Are you all familiar with this? It stands for 2 things. It's either explosively formed penetrator or explosively formed projectile. I've heard it both ways. But if I can take a minute and describe it. It costs maybe $90 to make, $100. It's a tube. Tube is packed with explosives. And at the end of the tube was a milled copper disc about the size of a dinner plate. Typically a dinner plate, sometimes a lunch plate. But it was at the end. And leading from the tube into the shadows somewhere in East Baghdad, either through a wire or through some kind of remote control device, was a guy with a trigger, waiting for a convoy to reach a particular aiming point. And when it reached the point, he'd depress the trigger. The explosives would explode. The disc would move forward at such a high velocity it would become semi-molten, almost take on a tadpole shape, and simply burn through whatever was in its way, whether it was a person, whether it was a Humvee that had the thickest armored door the military was providing soldiers, $200,000 Humvee, a $100 EFP, went right through the door. It went right through any soldier inside in its way. That's what began happening in East Baghdad and to the soldiers of this battalion, the 216. And the excerpt I read at the beginning, they had just suffered their first KIA through an EFP. And basically, as the months went by of their deployment, and the EFPs kept going off, and the injuries mounted, and the explosions kept coming, and the deaths mounted, of course, these men were changed by it. The thing is, what made an EFP so insidious was the fact that it could be hidden just about anywhere, and it was. They were hidden in animal carcasses. They were disguised as pieces of curbing or pieces of wall. They were hidden in piles of trash. And I can tell you from my own experience that in East Baghdad at that point, everything was pretty much a pile of trash. So despite the best sensors, guys on the lookout for these things, you couldn't see them all. There were just too many to see, too well hidden. And they kept going off. And as I said in the video, seeing the calculations a 19-year-old would make against this weapon was frankly heartbreaking to see a 19-year-old. And look, I know it's war and they volunteered, but still, when you see a 19-year-old sitting in a Humvee deciding to put one foot in front of the other because, maybe he'll lose 1 foot that day instead of 2, or tucking his hands behind his armor, or just sort of, without even realizing it, leaning away from the door a little bit, or riding around with his mouth open so if the main charge didn't get him, the concussions wouldn't jellify his insides. One of the things that happened to me is I had the luxury of going away. These guys were there for 14 months. I was with them for 8 months on the ground. But if I got cooked, if I got tired, I could leave. I could go to the Washington Post Baghdad Bureau, take a helicopter to a convoy, get to the bureau, get a little drunk if I wanted to, take a few days off, not worry about rocket attacks or mortar attacks, come back to the States and do reporting. And the soldiers didn't have that luxury. For 14 months, except for 18 days at home, out every day, again, getting into the Humvees, joking sometimes about what their last words ought to be, and off they would go again. And I can tell you, by the end of it, the simple act of watching these guys go out was the bravest and stupidest thing I'd ever seen. So, that's the book. What happened to these guys? Each chapter begins with a quote from George W. Bush. An example of a quote is on September 4th, when he went to Australia. He was overheard on the tarmac in a discussion with the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, who asked how the war is going. Bush's answer was, "We're kicking ass." And a chapter begins with that. And it's not to make fun of Bush, but to point out the difference between the war to Bush, and by extension people in Washington who make policy, who spend money, who think in large ways about what a war ought to be, and to the soldiers in Baghdad on September 4th, that same day. EFP goes off, 3 soldiers are immediately dead, and to them, what else could a war be except for 3 guys dead on a road called Route Predators? There are characters in the book who I think are important to point out and talk about for a few minutes. This is Ralph Koslerich right before they left Fort Riley, Kansas, to go to Baghdad, addressing his men for a last time, kind of a rally the troops moment. This is his XO, a guy named Brent Cummings, a major who in many ways is not just the moral voice of the book, but the moral voice, I think, of any of us who would be there, who at the beginning of the book was concerning himself. His soldiers were trying to move into a community, to build an outpost, to be closer to the people. And they found an abandoned factory. And they lifted a little lid on the ground and realized it was a septic tank with a floating cadaver in the septic tank, in the soup in Iraqi. And it became not only important, but essential to Brent Cummings to figure out a way to get that body out of there. Not only so his 160-man company could move in, but out of respect to someone who, as he put it, was someone's son, probably someone's husband, and you don't just leave a man floating in a septic tank, even a cadaver. By the end of the book, when things finally totally fell apart for this battalion, Brent Cummings was watching a video monitor of Iraqis shooting at Americans and screaming at the top of his lungs, "Die, monkeys, die." So that's what happened to Brent Cummings. I did my best to bring Iraqi voices into the book. It was difficult because it was very difficult to move around Iraq at that point, unlike other places I've been. But there's a character named Izzy. That's the name he went by. He was an Iraqi national who was an interpreter for the Americans, who, among other things, loved America so much that among the few possessions he carried with him was a frequent flyer card from Pan American World Airways. It's interesting when a few days ago when those bombs went off outside the hotels in downtown Baghdad. After I finished the book, I introduced Izzy to the person who ran the Washington Post Baghdad bureau, who then subsequently hired Izzy to be an interpreter there. And as I understand it, Izzy heard the first blast and heard the second blast, which was closer, and then heard gunfire and just began picking up people and throwing them into the safe room. And that's when the third blast occurred, pretty much ruining the Washington Post Baghdad bureau and leaving Izzy with broken ribs, broken arm. So, anyway, he's a great guy. There's a soldier named Michael Emery, and at the end of April, Emery was on a rooftop during a mission to try to bring a particular part of East Baghdad under control, and he was shot in the back of the head by a sniper. So when I talk about a disconnect, the war here and the war there, Emery was airlifted to Landstuhl, then to Bethesda, and every day Ralph Koslerich would get an update on how Emery was coming along. He's doing better. He sat up. He told his wife, "I love you." And you could see Koslerich, just every time a report came in, he'd feel so much better. He's getting better. It's going to work out for him. That was the report on Emery in Baghdad. A few weeks after he was shot, I needed a break. I came back home. I went to Bethesda Naval, and this is a photograph of Michael Emery with his wife, Maria. And if I could read a second excerpt from the book. "Give me your hand, baby," Maria Emery said to her husband, who was diapered, who could barely move, who had a ventilator tube inserted into his throat, who was looking in panic at his wife, who was armored in a mask and gown and gloves. And when she took his right hand and wrapped it around hers, he emitted a high-pitched whimper. "Are you cold?" she asked. He didn't answer, just looked at her, less panicked now. His head was as misshapen as the moon over Rustamaya. "Baby," she said, leaning closer. "Sweetheart," she said, even closer. She straightened up. He whimpered again. "So this is what I do now," she explained, of what life had been since a phone call at 2:30 p.m. on April 28th in which the Department of Defense informed her that her husband had been shot, and now she added details by reading from a diary she had been keeping since then. "May the 3rd. I kissed him on his lips. This was in Germany. I told him, 'I'm going to kiss you on the lips, and if you can feel it, move.' And I kissed him twice, and he moved both times. May the 6th. We got on the medevac flight, and we flew from Germany here to Bethesda. May the 17th. He opened his eyes for the very first time. May the 19th. He moved his fingers and his legs, and I told him that I loved him, and he started crying. May the 21st. He slept most of the time. May the 25th. The president came to see him." And now she put the diary down as she thought about the day that President Bush came to visit, about what he had said to her. He said, "Thank you for your husband's service to his country," and he was sorry for what our family was going through. About what she'd said to him, "Thank you for coming." About what she wished she had said to him, that he didn't understand what we were going through because he doesn't know how it feels, and that I didn't agree with what was going on with this war. About why she hadn't said it, because I felt it would not have made any difference, and my husband, of course, had his eyes open, and I didn't want him getting upset. About what Bush didn't understand. I mean, when I saw him, I was so angry I started crying, and he saw me and came to me and gave me a hug and said, "Everything's going to be okay." That was why he came over to her, she said, because he misunderstood the reason for her tears. He'd had no idea that they were because of anger, and he'd had no idea that they were because of him. And nothing was okay, she said. So he was wrong about that, too. Her husband was ruined. In 7 weeks, she had lost so much weight that her dress size had gone from a 12 to a 6. Her daughter was now living with a relative. She was now living in a hospital. The doctors were saying it could be years before her husband would be better, if ever. And hope, if it existed at all, had to be extracted from wherever it could, from the awful day, for instance, in which he lifted his right hand and placed it on her shoulder, and then tried to move it across her breasts, and then started to cry. So many tears in this place, and now there were more from her as he closed his eyes and dozed off, and she knew he couldn't see her. She stepped out of the room. She removed the glasses, the gown, the gloves, the mask. She hurried to a vending machine to get something to eat, and then came right back so she would be next to him when he woke up. Gown back on, mask back on, gloves back on, waiting. He opened his eyes. For a moment there was alarm, and then he saw her. There she was, as if she had not moved. "Can you give me a kiss?" she said. "Can you give me a kiss?" She leaned in until her mask was against his lips. "I love you, baby," she said, and then drew back, sensing that something was wrong. But what? What could it be? "Are you cold?" she guessed. He looked at her. "Are you cold?" He moved his lips, ever so slightly. He seemed to be trying to answer. She moved her ear to his mouth. More hope. "Yes," he said. There's a guy named Adam Schumann who was one of the very best soldiers in the battalion. When Emery was shot, they needed to get him down 3 flights of stairs, and it was a little too narrow for a litter. So finally, Schumann put great big Michael Emery on his back in a fireman's carry and took him down the stairs. And it was just the angle of things that all the blood from Michael Emery's head kept going into Adam Schumann's mouth. 6 months later, when this picture was taken, Adam Schumann was still tasting that blood. And after 3 deployments and 1,000 days in Iraq, the time had come for him to go home. He just couldn't do it anymore. Guilty as hell, he packed up and went home to a wife who was worried and continues to be worried that he's going to kill her. And I walked with him to the helicopter, and there was a line of soldiers waiting for the next ones to come in. Helicopters land. Everyone moves forward to get on the helicopter. Schumann gets to the front of the line. Hand goes down. Guy yells, "This isn't your helicopter." Everyone else gets on board. Helicopter lifts off, leaving only Adam Schumann. A few minutes later, another helicopter comes in, big Red Cross on the side. It's the helicopter for the wounded and the dead. And Adam Schumann was both in many ways. He's home now in Kansas. It's interesting. By almost universal acknowledgement, he was one of the very best soldiers in that battalion. Home now, no Purple Heart. No acknowledgement of what he had done because of policies in place that say, you get a Purple Heart if you're truly wounded, but as far as the system is concerned, for valid reasons, Adam Schumann's wounds aren't deep enough. The blood is only in his mouth and his mind. It's not real blood. There's one more soldier I want to talk about for a minute, named Duncan Crookston. On September 4th, when Bush was in Australia, and an EFP went off in eastern Baghdad and went into a Humvee, and 3 soldiers from the 216 died, there was a 4th who lost both of his legs, and there was a 5th, a 19-year-old named Adam Schumann, who lost both of his legs all the way up, lost his right arm here, lost his left arm to here. And the little that remained of Duncan Crookston was very badly burned, but he didn't die. Airlifted out, first to Landstuhl and then to Brooke Army Medical Center outside of San Antonio. 4 months later, when Lieutenant Colonel Koslerich is on his home leave, he ends his leave by going to see his wounded soldiers, including Duncan Crookston. So there's Duncan being tended to by his mother, Lee Crookston, a great woman, his 20-year-old wife, Megan, in the burn unit at BAMC. And Koslerich goes down a long hall and then it turns into Duncan's room and sees, it almost didn't make sense. It's just a bit of a body, totally wrapped, bolted to a bed, unable to move because he has no leverage to turn himself in any particular way. Just there, full-size bed, what was left of him. A little bit of skin on his face was visible, still burned, and he was wearing a pair of goggles. By that point, 4 months in, 30 surgeries. His ears had fallen off, his nose had fallen off, his eyebrows were gone, his eyelids were gone. And he's wearing these goggles to produce moisture in his eyes because his eyes simply can't produce moisture. And so inside the goggles are droplets of condensation. So everything that came into Duncan's view basically swam into view. here came Ralph Koslerich, and it's maybe the only day I was with him when he didn't say it's all good. He saw Duncan, he just went, bastards. But he went over, and he did the best he could, talked to Duncan, gave him some medals. No acknowledgement really from Duncan. Koslerich left immediately for the airport, flew back to Kuwait, flew back to Iraq, went into his office, turned on his computer. It was 5 days later. There was an email from Duncan's mother saying Duncan had died. So that was one more death that seemed to diminish everybody. And, on it went. It's not that every day was bad. And it's not that everyone got wounded. It's not that 14 deaths, 10% were Purple Hearts. But being in the middle of this thing for so long, where nothing really made sense, undoubtedly had a cumulative effect on these guys. So by the time they came home, obviously they were changed, but it's sincere and serious, and it's ongoing. The question is, did the surge work? Was it worth it for these guys? And better they answer it than I do, because they were the ones in the middle of it. And if you have 800 guys, you're going to get 800 answers. But there would have been a lot more agreement that they had made a difference if what happened at the end had not happened. And here's what happened at the end. Do you all remember in March 2008 when the Prime Minister of Iraq decided to show that his forces were ready to stand up on their own, and he took them into Basra to secure Basra? Well, it was fairly well reported what happened as a result of that in the short term. There were a lot of defections. There were a lot of civilian deaths. It was a bit messy at first. What was unreported was the effects of that decision in other parts of Iraq, including outside of Sadr City, where the 216, done with their deployment, was packing up to go home. They were done. They were finished. All they had to do was pack and get out of there. And then this happened, and just like that, their area descended into the absolute worst fighting of the entire deployment. Counterinsurgency was out the window. It was just a plain, flat-out, 24-hour fight for the last 8 days of their deployment. And of course, another EFP went off, and a lot of them did, but one was aimed pretty well, and killed 2 more soldiers who simply thought they were about to go home. One named Patrick Miller, probably the one I knew the best, a very sweet kid from Florida. The convoy was led by this guy, Nate Showman, a junior officer, the one who many people thought was very much like Ralph Koslerich when this thing got underway. And let me very quickly read one more excerpt at the end of the book. Because Ralph Koslerich ended up writing one more speech for a memorial ceremony, and then he wanted to see Nate Showman to find out what happened that day. In another part of the fob, Nate Showman was writing too. "Ray, baby," he wrote to his new wife. He had come in at 7:55 a.m. with blood on his boots and a sadness so thorough that he'd been unable to speak, even when a few soldiers asked him how he was doing. His answer was to shake his head and stare at the ground. He had spent the rest of the day in isolation, and only now had he found some words he wanted to say, writing to his wife, "I'm going to need some help when I get home." He slept only a little that night, even though he was exhausted, and the next day, at Koslerich's request, he went reluctantly to the operations center for debriefing. The two of them had always been able to talk more easily than most commanders and junior officers, maybe because Showman's self-confidence and methodical thinking in some ways reminded Koslerich of himself. "I'm just trying to figure out what the hell happened," Koslerich said now to Showman, getting right to it. And when Showman looked at him in silence, Koslerich said quietly, "If you would, just talk me through." So Showman began by telling Koslerich about what Patrick Miller was doing just before he died, that he was standing outside of his Humvee, eating a date that he'd been given by an Iraqi national policeman. "The last thing I saw of Little Miller," is how he put it. And he didn't bother to explain that Miller was called Little Miller to differentiate him from Big Miller, a soldier with a back so hairy that there would be bets among soldiers over who would be brave enough to lick it. Or about the night his soldiers woke him up, and there was Little Miller, dancing in front of him, naked except for sunglasses, an M4, a bandana, and a thong, and laughing hysterically as he chanted, "I'm ready to fight terrorists." All of his soldiers were laughing, and he had laughed too. He'd been crazy about Miller. Little Miller was putting a can of gas in the trunk. The national guy gave him a date, he said, and he didn't bother with the rest of it, that the reason the Iraqi gave him a date was out of gratitude. And the reason for the gratitude was that the Americans had come to save him, and the reason that the Americans had come to save him because they had been trying to save him since 2003, when the number of dead American soldiers was 0, and Patrick Miller was 19 years old and about to start college and thinking that he was going to become a doctor someday. And instead, he took a date and ate it and gave the guy the thumbs up and got back in the truck, Showman said. And then the truck took off on a route that Showman had just thought of, which led straight into an exploding EFP. So, look, Schumann, Emory, Crookston, all these guys. The 1 battalion, they didn't have the worst of it. They didn't have the best of it. It wasn't the worst. They probably weren't the best battalion. They weren't the worst battalion. They were right down the middle. They tried hard, did well, for a policy that they had no part in except to volunteer for the Army. They went optimistically. They came back broken. And as we all move in, the war continues on inside them. And of course, it'll continue for the rest of their lives. And I'm not saying their experience or what's in this book should be the defining factor in what policy is, but it needs to be part of it. And it's not enough for us sitting here, rather segmented and segregated from this war, to open the paper and see a headline that says, 3 soldiers die in East Baghdad from roadside bomb, and think, shit, 3 more soldiers, that's too bad. There's more to it than that. Just as there's more than we know to the decisions Bush made or Obama makes or anybody in power makes for what policy should be, there's more to it about the effects of that policy. And it's important for you as you go forward or do your work now to consider the far reaches of that headline, the 3 died, because it's Duncan Crookston. If it's a shooting, it's Michael Emery. It's all these guys. It's a bit preachy. This is probably a good place to stop and see if there are questions.
Thank you very much, David. I have a question. Let me start with a question, and then we go to the floor. You talked about the disconnect, and I recall a passage in your book where these generals are coming to testify on the Hill. Aren't the generals supposed to tell us what is going on the ground? But you don't get that sense at all,
Well, my sense is they're supposed to tell some of what's going on the ground, just enough to
Are
give
they also disconnected with the reality, what goes on the ground?
Yeah, but that's not, yes. But I would say yes. But no one can be fully connected. I mean, if you're a private, you're probably interested in your sergeant, maybe your captain, and that's about as far as your interest goes. If you're General Petraeus, you're concerned with a couple levels down from you, plus everything going on in Washington, and that's pretty much how the standard to be interested in. So, it's funny. So every time there was an event, these soldiers would try to write a narrative and storyboard the thing and send it forward. And it would join all the other storyboards from all the other platoons and companies and battalions going forth, and eventually becoming metrics that defined reports to Congress, I guess. This is, I'm generalizing. But the thing is, do you all remember, it's interesting, when Petraeus, you remember in September 2007 when Petraeus testified in Washington, it was this huge event. It was like a movie star coming. So Petraeus is here for a couple of days. Well, he was here all week. Flies back to Baghdad. And then, as it happens, he goes to FOB Rustamaya, where the 216 is. And this is a big deal because nobody ever went to this base. No congressional delegations. I think in the whole time I was there, the only celebrity that showed up was a PGA golfer that the golfers had never even heard of. It's just a place that no one came to for whatever reason. And Petraeus came, and this was a big thing. And he came, and he's sitting shoulder to shoulder next to Ralph Koslerich. And And Koslerich could sit there, I guess, and choose to tell Petraeus about all the bad things that had happened, but he didn't do that. He chose to tell him about the very best thing his battalion had done, which was there was a fuel station across the way from the FOB, and the lines to get gasoline could last for 2 days because of the black market, because of insurgents controlling the fuel lines to get money to build EFPs. Koslerich, very simply and elegantly, put a platoon of soldiers there to bring it under control. And in fact, it helped because lines went from 2 days down to as short as 15 minutes. And Koslerich is telling Petraeus about this, and Petraeus interrupts and says, "We know about this. We need to do more of this around Baghdad." And you could just feel like the happy rays coming off Ralph Koslerich because it had worked its way up the line to Petraeus. He had heard about this. And of all the days I was there, I don't think I ever saw Ralph Koslerich happier. Petraeus leaves. 2 hours later, 3 hours later, Koslerich is standing outside and just so frickin' happy about this. Beautiful day. Boom. Turns his head. Here comes the coil of smoke from the fuel station. The platoon was leaving, an EFP went off, hit a convoy, and tore into a soldier named Joshua Reeves. And so what happened is he went from about the happiest guy to standing in the aid station, watching the results of his effort to bring a fuel station under control dying in front of his eyes. And I guess that's how it can be two wars, if that's a rather long answer, not specific, but anyway, you can only know what you know, right?
The mic, please. Thank you.
My name is Stephen Shore. I think you've shown you have a very vivid, excellent writer, and at the risk of sounding cold-blooded, one could do this kind of work for any military conflict. I think the first writer I know who have done this, and your prose reminds me a good deal of his, is Homer's Iliad, where he describes the sufferings of the Greeks and the Trojans impartially and with great effect. But the sufferings, logically, of soldiers in any conflict say nothing about the morality, necessity, or outcome of the conflict, and I'm by no means convinced that should we attain victory, whatever that might be, in Iraq, that these men would have suffered or died more happily than they did. And the sufferings, I think, unfortunately, this is a necessity in any sustained combat. The only difference is the specifics of how men and now women suffer and die. But it doesn't say anything about the necessity of the war or the possible outcome or what would the consequences have been were we not there in the first place. So I think there's always this burden of argument because you can always portray vividly and effectively, as you unquestionably have done, but in the absence of a possible scenario of the absence of this conflict, argument is inevitably tilted. And you've described the trees magnificently, but I'm not much clearer about the nature of the forest than when I first entered this room.
Right. That's fair, and I appreciate that. And there are probably 300 pages from the book I didn't read. But I don't think those will satisfy you or answer your question either. First of all, as far as the universality of the story, I appreciate hearing that. It's funny, one of the blurbs for the book, somebody said, this may be the best book on war since the Iliad. And I thanked her, saying, you've now created an entire new generation of high schoolers with another book never to read. So, yeah, I didn't want to pronounce the war, and I am unqualified to do that. What I felt qualified to do was simply add to the literature on this war. And I don't think there can be a perfect book that does it all. But to my mind, a corner of the story was missing. And so when I describe it, this is a simple book and a small book, it is in many ways. It's not, I had a few goals to tell an honest story about what happened, and not to descend into what we kind of call war porn, where I seem to be just trafficking in gory details without any larger effect. But the larger effect is to respectfully describe what happened. It's not to go all the way up the line and answer questions about morality. Ethics, perhaps the ethics of war, of a soldier on a particular day, maybe so. But morality, no, the best I could do is just supply some missing information and let people absorb it and have discussions about morality with their own selves.
Yes. Mona, it's easier to come from the middle. This thing, yeah. Just here to, yeah.
Thank you for both writing the book and for this talk. And in thinking about how you ended it with the kind of policy question, I wanted to ask you about how you had gone from maybe a policy direction, and I'd be interested to hear your response, rather than about the war in general, would be towards advocating for the soldiers and Marines that have been part of the war when they come out of the war. Because I know there's been a lot of discussions about, well, you mentioned the guy who didn't get a Purple Heart because he didn't actually ever lose his own blood in this, but trying to think about mental illness. And I know the MHAT, the mental health assessment teams that have been looking at these things have really gotten at that. And I think your book would really be an important push to get the more policy-oriented people in alignment with defense to really think about how our modern systems of war are affecting people in other ways.
Well, it may, or if there's work I do or anyone does down the line, I'd like to think it could add to that. It would be a valuable thing. You know, it sounds a bit corny. As a journalist, I can't. I'd be uncomfortable being an advocate. I'm really old school on this. Of course, I'm making selections when I tell the story I tell, but I'm not doing it to advocate anything other than the importance of information, if that's fair. You know, I can sit here in this group and maybe suggest, I hope I didn't go too far, but maybe suggest it might be unfair to some people that Adam Schuman does not have a Purple Heart. I don't know. But the fact is he doesn't. And this is off point, but it's something I wanted to, I should have made clear earlier. When I said that the only policy in the book, really, other than the effects of policy, is to quote George Bush at the beginning of each chapter and then to describe what was going on in this part of the war on that particular day. You know, I don't feel qualified to I read things you all have probably produced. I read widely about these things, and I have thoughts that inform my reporting, I guess. But I don't want to take shots at policy unless I can come to a conclusion. And the only way I seem to be able to come to a conclusion is to observe something intimately and for a fairly long time. I might have some conclusions about these soldiers and about what they did, but I came to them honestly. If I tried to offer opinions about policy, they would be dishonest conclusions because I embedded with this group of soldiers. I didn't embed with Bush or anybody else when they were making their decisions about what to do, what they were weighing. Maybe I know what they were weighing, but I don't know. And so I can have my moments of anger when I'm watching Joshua Reeves die, and I can still get angry about it. But you know, in many ways, it's an uninformed anger, except knowing what I saw in front of me. And when it comes to policy, it's not a cop-out. I admire enormously anybody in this time who's in any kind of decision-making position who has to make a decision like, all right, we're going to send 30,000 more into Afghanistan. And it's not just putting up with all the hoo-ha in Washington, oh, he should, oh, he shouldn't, this and that. It's finally being alone to make that decision. This is way off point, but and it is a bit of an opinion, but it comes from personal experience. I thought that one of the great things that Obama did before making his Afghanistan decision. And I don't know if it was his motivation was political, if it was that calculated or something more than that. But he went to Dover one night, and he stayed awake all night as 18 flag-draped coffins came through. And he went onto the plane 4 times, and he walked out with the coffins, and then he stood there as 18 of these boxes went past him. And even, unless you are the most green-blooded, hard-hearted, inhuman person ever, if you stand there in the middle of the night and watch these things go past, it's going to stay with you. And maybe this is a better answer to your question. My book was, I guess, kind of an attempt to replicate the feeling you might get when you stand there and watch 18 coffins go past. In this case, 14.
Hardis and then Roxana.
Thank you. I also want to thank you for adding a really important piece to the puzzle. As an anthropologist, I'm particularly thrilled to have qualitative narratives instead of just numbers that are constantly thrown at you. My question is a bit relating to sort of the inverse of the story of, I think it was Brent Cummings. Mm-hmm. So you hear stories of, like Brent Cummings, somebody go there with, very open heart, and then at the end they end up kind of cold. But I've started also hearing the inverse of people going there kind of out to get the bad guys and starting to really identify with the population. And one of the stories I've been hearing recently, which I'm very interested in, is soldiers coming back, having met people there or converting to Islam, etc. And I wonder if you came upon any stories like that, any sort of the opposite, and what that was like.
I didn't, and it might have happened in front of me, and I just didn't see it. It's not something I took note of. But I saw sincere efforts at the beginning give way to hardened efforts, and I saw, these are mostly young guys, and we all. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the military at this point, it affects certain sections of the country and the economy more than other parts. Maybe more patriotic. That's generalizing, but maybe more patriotic. Maybe. A lot of these guys had never been out of their home state before they went to Kansas, and then they flew from Kansas into Kuwait, and then they landed in the middle of the night in this place, and they didn't know where they were until they crept up. A few of them crept up into a guard tower at dawn and peeled back or poked their heads out or whatever they did, and just saw that they were surrounded by fields and fields and fields of burning trash. And one guy said, "Good God, how are we going to find an IED in all of this shit?" And it began that day. Any optimism they came with, it was kind of a naivety, I guess, and they realized that eventually. And it's not that they came back mean, but they came back wounded, because every person there was touched by something bad and took it personally, and you can't help. I mean, I think we could forgive anybody in these circumstances, any side who doesn't act selfishly, but absorbs it and takes it personally. And these guys had a rough time of it. And by the end of it, it's the old canard. I guess it's true in every war. You go over thinking you're going to do something big and believing in mission. By the end of it, there was pretty much a universal bitterness and exhaustion. And I'm only there because the guy next to me is there. And that's all I care about at this point. I like hearing what you're saying, and I wish I had seen it. And perhaps it didn't happen. But in my experiences, I didn't see it. But that's not to denigrate these guys for not moving in that direction. I thought almost to a man they acted quite well for their circumstances.
Roxana.
Roxana Bahrami-Tash from here. I just want to congratulate you, David, because in November I was in Afghanistan and a bomb when there was suicide bombing, and it, I didn't have to be there, so it does leave you shaken even if you're there and you can leave. On the question of, so you're very brave, and I want to praise you for putting a human face to the suffering of casualties of this war. But when I was in Damascus a year after where you were in 2008, and I was talking to Iraqi refugees in this poor neighborhood of Damascus, and you know, I'm not someone who is naive or doesn't read alternative media. I do read alternative media, but I had no sense of the war, and that's what you're bringing. And to pick up on Paradis, what I learned is that you talk about insurgents, but really there was a civil war. And this street was fighting with the other street, and who may or may not be Shia, Sunni, or it wasn't just Iraqi, American, it was Shia, Sunni, 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 Shia, Shia, and just these streets against the other two. And I don't know if you came across that, you got any sense of that, maybe from those who fled from Iraq.
Well, my sense would come from reading other reports about people who were either IDPs or headed to Amman, particularly, and Damascus. This was really hard to report on fully because, as I said, it was dangerous, and I'm used to being in places where I can get around on my own and do my own independent interviews, and that wasn't the case here. And when I went out, you know, geez, imagine you're an Iraqi and here comes an American convoy, and of course you have to pull over while they go past, and the traffic jams are ridiculous, and then here come the people to make you feel better about your neighborhood, and you're just standing there, and they get out of their armored Humvees, and just like you could barely see a bit of Duncan Crookston and Bamsey, you could barely see an American under all the gear they had to wear for their own protection: helmets, goggles, earplugs, body armor, knee pads, elbow pads, boots, pants tucked in. Not a lot of skin showing in Baghdad. And, you know, I wrote about a part of the war, but maybe this will be a fair thing to say. You'll understand this. The book I'm waiting for, the book I would like to read more than any other book, is a book written by an Iraqi who was in the war while I was there. Because probably, you know, my guess is if you're an Iraqi, the surge was an American invention, an American term. If you're an Iraqi, this is a war that's been going on a long time and will go on a long time. And this 1 year period that was so important to American outcome, maybe less so to an Iraqi. I'd love to read that book.
Last question, please.
One of the things that you alluded to very briefly at the end, and one of the things that is of concern to me, is the extent to which this war has been hidden from the American public. There has been no sacrifice made by the American public. Wherever the preceding administration could prevent us from seeing the horrors that went on in the war, could be prevented. They were prevented. We couldn't see the bodies coming back from Dover. What do you think would have happened if a book like yours had been written earlier, that the American public could have understand the damage that was being done to our young people? I mean, even the budget was hidden because everything was done by supplementals. It didn't even have the courage to put it in the budget. The reporting obviously was as brave as it could be. But what could have been done to have brought the reality of this war more to the American public?
Yeah, wow, that's quite a question. So if there hadn't been a policy prohibiting imagery of the returning bodies, would it have made a difference? Oh, God. I don't know. What do you think? My guess is maybe for a little bit of time, but maybe not.
If Walter Reed had happened 3 years earlier,
Yeah.
That would have meant something.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know where obviously the people who were supposed to be looking after the veterans weren't looking after veterans. I don't know whether there was any way that the press could have gotten an earlier read on that one. But there seems to have been a complete isolation of what went on
Well, yes, yes. We're not right. I think we can agree that most of us are not directly related to this war. We occupy a place where we might know somebody who heard of somebody who might have a son, or is it a nephew, or maybe it's even a niece who was in Iraq, or maybe it's Afghanistan. And you're right, it's not like factories were shut down to suddenly start making vehicles that could better withstand EFPs or IEDs. So we're not so connected to the war, and even though great information about this war has gotten out there, it's not up to the administration prohibiting pictures. They don't get the final call on what information is. It's up to reporters, I think, to find a way in there and to report on the thing whenever they can and however they can. And the efforts, I think, have been fairly steady through the war. But I don't know, not a lot of interest in this war, is there? I've written a book that I was told was just going to sink like a stone because no one cares about Iraq anymore. That hasn't quite happened. The book got some great reviews and some word of mouth, and it's hanging in there. But, it's not a Dan Brown book. It's not a Sarah Palin book. And I can come here and we can talk for a few minutes, and you all, I detect a curiosity and even an eagerness to hear about this, but you're in the minority. To most people, you know what people want now? They want to know it worked, and when everybody comes home next year, one for America, and that's knowing what I know now. That's a hard thing to acknowledge, but I think it's the way it is. That's a bad answer, but I think our time is up. I just wanted to thank you all, and please, as you go forward in your work, just try to keep some of this in mind. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. The book is on sale outside, and David will sign it and get it and also give it to